Most history books tell the American Revolution as a tale of ideals. Battle for liberty, a stand against taxation without representation, and the birth of a nation built on philosophy. Yet, if you look deeper past the famous speeches, the fiery pamphlets, and the stories of heroism, you uncover another force driving events. Beneath the rhetoric, beneath the symbols of patriotism, there was a harder truth. The economic ties between Britain and its colonies were unraveling. The empire's financial system no longer balanced, and when the numbers failed, so did authority. Colonists did not rise merely because of slogans or lofty ideals. They rebelled because the economic framework that bound them to Britain had become untenable. In a chapter often overlooked, the creation of the United States was funded by foreign powers who viewed the colonies not as freedom fighters, but as instruments of leverage. Welcome to the Capsule Decode, where money, strategy, and history intersect, and nothing is ever simple. To understand why the colonies reached a breaking point, we must trace the story back decades before 1776. Britain had emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, yet the triumph came at a staggering cost. The national treasury groaned under a mountain of debt, interest payments soared, and London's political elite faced an urgent need for revenue. Their solution seemed straightforward. The colonies, beneficiaries of imperial protection, should help shoulder the financial burden. Taxes that had barely existed before were suddenly enforced with intensity. Duties multiplied, regulations tightened, and new levies appeared at every turn. While Parliament viewed these measures as practical accounting, colonists experienced them as an economic straitjacket. They were expected to contribute to an empire that offered them little say and even fewer benefits. From London's vantage point, the colonies were assets, resources to exploit for the metropole's gain. For the colonists, however, the dynamic felt like captivity. The prevailing economic system, mercantilism, dictated that colonial wealth flowed upward to Britain. American merchants could trade only on British terms, using British ships, and through channels controlled by the Crown. Even when local businesses flourished, the profits sailed across the Atlantic, leaving the colonies financially dependent. And when Britain needed immediate cash, the colonies became a limitless ATM, a reservoir of wealth to be tapped at whim. Yet the most destabilizing factor was currency control. The Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, largely forgotten today, were devastating. Colonies were forbidden from issuing their own paper money. Without a local medium, credit vanished, debts multiplied, and ordinary farmers and merchants struggled to pay British creditors. A modern economist would describe this as deflation, a severe contraction of available capital. In the colonial context, it felt like suffocation. Imagine running a business while barred from accessing the currency your economy depends on. For ordinary colonists, this created immense strain. For the elite, it threatened fortunes. Figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, heavily indebted in pounds sterling, watched their financial futures slip as tobacco prices fell and credit tightened. Independence, then, became not just a political statement, but a chance to reset personal and public ledgers. The initial sparks of resistance were political, but the underlying fuel was financial. When Britain increased taxes and imposed duties, the colonies resisted, but it was the control over money itself that broke the system. Colonial economies were being starved, not just governed. It became easy to rally discontent when every social class, from small farmers to wealthy planters, felt the tightening grip of fiscal constraint. Yet even mounting anger revealed a hard truth. Revolutions require money. Armies, ammunition, and daily sustenance cost more than ideological fervor alone could supply. The Continental Congress was financially impotent, unable to fund the very rebellion it sought to lead. The broader story often overlooked is that the colonies did not win independence through strategy or military might alone. Britain's enemies, seeing opportunity, quietly extended financial support. France, eager to weaken its historic rival, became the first backer. But it did so covertly, establishing fronts that masked arms, shipments, and funds. Secret networks delivered gunpowder, rifles, and gold, all disguised as trade. Spain followed a similar route, funneling silver through Caribbean ports. It's motivated not by sympathy for liberty, but by strategic advantage. Dutch financiers, centered in Amsterdam, treated the rebellion as an investment, extending credit and legitimizing America's financial position on the international stage. Independence, in essence, was financed before it was declared, turning rebellion into a calculated economic endeavor. While foreign support was critical, some of the most decisive contributions came from within the colonies themselves. Colonial financiers acted as the hidden backbone of the revolution, transforming ideas into resources. Silas Deane, America's first unofficial diplomat, negotiated French arms deals even before independence was formally declared, setting the stage for a supply chain that sustained the Continental Army. Robert Morris, Philadelphia's wealthiest merchant, assumed a central role akin to a modern-day central banker. He personally financed military operations, leveraged his reputation to secure private loans, and filled the financial void where Congress could not. And then there was Haym Salomon, a Polish Jewish immigrant with a vast network of contacts in New York and Philadelphia. Salomon converted foreign loans into cash, extended credit to the revolutionary government, and ensured that soldiers on the front lines continued to receive pay during the darkest periods of the conflict. Generals could win battles, but without these financial lifelines, the war would have collapsed before it truly began. The infusion of funds from Europe and the Caribbean did more than keep armies supplied. It fundamentally reshaped the structure of the conflict. Congress issued paper currency, known as continentals, which rapidly depreciated as inflation swept through colonial economies. Soldiers were paid in bills whose purchasing power dwindled by the month, and civilians hoarded tangible goods instead of currency that could no longer be trusted. From this chaos emerged a speculative class. Individuals who purchased government bonds at a fraction of their face value, betting that the fledgling nation would one day redeem them. These transactions, risky as they were, seeded the foundations of American high finance. The revolution was not only a political upheaval, it was a financial gamble, a deliberate integration into a network of global capital. Yet foreign financing carried hidden consequences. Loans are never without strings, and debt creates influence. France, Spain, and Dutch bankers were not motivated solely by sympathy for the colonial cause. They were making strategic investments, seeking to weaken Britain while positioning themselves to gain leverage in the new American state. By accepting these funds, the colonies inadvertently tied their future to external powers. The founders spoke in the language of freedom, but creditors spoke in the language of opportunity. Economic realities and international politics intersected, forcing the United States to navigate delicate relationships even as it fought for its very survival. Within the colonies, the effects were immediate and profound. Wealth flowed in unevenly, creating new opportunities for those who could access it. Speculators and financiers capitalized on instability, purchasing bonds, commodities, and land at undervalued prices. The war, in effect, became a financial ecosystem, with risk, scarcity, and foresight driving fortunes as much as muskets and strategy. Ordinary citizens bore the strain of inflation and scarce resources, while a new class of investors emerged, laying the groundwork for the American financial elite of the post-war era. Independence was not only won on the battlefield, it was bought, brokered, and calculated in ledger books correspondence, and clandestine meetings across Europe and the colonies alike. The revolution, therefore, was both a political and an economic act. Military victories were inseparable from financial maneuvers, and strategic alliances with foreign creditors proved decisive. Without this combination of internal resourcefulness and external funding, the fragile experiment of independence might have failed. The economic dimension of rebellion, often invisible in traditional narratives, was as central to victory as strategy, courage, or ideology. Colonists did not merely declare freedom. They orchestrated the complex financial infrastructure necessary to make that declaration a reality. Victory on the battlefield marked only the first stage of the revolution's financial story. Independence brought sovereignty, but it also brought enormous obligations. The United States emerged deeply indebted. Foreign loans were immense, domestic finances were fragile, and the continental currency was disintegrating under rampant inflation. Sovereignty offered freedom in theory, but in practice it meant navigating a web of debts and obligations to the very nations that had financed the rebellion. The fledgling nation could not simply dictate its own international policy without consequences. France, still holding substantial American debt, expected favorable trade terms. Spain leveraged its support to limit westward expansion and secure access to the Mississippi River. Dutch bankers demanded adherence to fiscal norms, ensuring the credibility of American bonds on the European stage. The young United States entered the global arena not as a fully independent actor, but as a debtor, negotiating from a position of weakness. This financial reality shaped the very structure of the new government. The ideological debates between Jefferson and Hamilton, often portrayed purely as philosophical conflicts, were deeply rooted in economic necessity. Jefferson envisioned a decentralized agrarian republic. Hamilton championed a strong, centralized financial state. Yet creditors demanded stability. European lenders would not extend credit to a loose confederation of states lacking unified revenue streams, a national banking system, or any assurance of repayment. To maintain credibility and secure future loans, Hamilton pushed for assumption of state debts, establishment of a national bank, federal control over taxation, and a strong central government. America adopted this system not only because Hamilton argued persuasively, but because economic survival left the nation little choice. Debt had become a guiding force in shaping ideology, governance, and policy. The implications extended domestically as well. To repay European creditors, the federal government needed revenue, necessitating enforceable taxes. When frontier farmers were taxed on distilled spirits, the Whiskey Rebellion erupted, exposing a stark irony. The country that had fought against taxation under British rule now deployed troops against its own citizens to meet financial obligations. Independence had not removed economic pressures. It had merely shifted their source. Similarly, financial vulnerability dictated foreign policy. When France sought military support in its conflict with Britain during the 1790s, invoking the alliance critical to the Revolution, the United States declined. It was too indebted, too fragile, and too dependent on trade and credit networks to risk involvement in European wars. Fiscal realities constrained diplomacy as decisively as ideology. This economic lens reveals an essential truth. The American Revolution extended far beyond the battlefield and the Declaration of Independence. It was a financial negotiation as much as a political struggle. Foreign creditors France, Spain, and Dutch financiers, Dudges and Dudge, wrote the rebellion. Shaping the new nation's early banking system, taxation policies, and diplomatic strategies, the creation of the United States was not only imagined, it was meticulously financed. The ideals of liberty and self-governance were critical, but the hidden machinery of capital, debt, and credit made independence possible. Understanding this intersection of finance and politics offers a deeper view of history. Revolutions succeed not on courage alone, but when economic forces, strategic funding, and geopolitical opportunity align. The story of the American Revolution didn't conclude with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. It evolved into a financial negotiation, one that molded the nation's banking system, taxation policies, international relations, and political identity. The ideals of freedom, equality, and self-rule mattered deeply. But beneath them ran a less celebrated reality. Foreign powers financed the struggle. America's leaders orchestrated the revolt, but France, Spain, and Dutch financiers were the silent architects of its feasibility. The revolution was, in many respects, a proxy war. The colonies served as the battlefield, Britain as the target, and money, more than muskets, shifted the balance of power. This strategy may sound familiar because it is. Even today, powerful nations still prefer funding conflicts abroad rather than committing their own forces. They arm insurgents, support rebellions, and channel resources through intermediaries. Noble language masks the pursuit of strategic advantage, just as it did in the 18th century. The logic remains consistent. Destabilize rivals without endangering your own population. Finance a revolution rather than deploy a fleet. Influence outcomes with loans, credit, and covert support, not overt declarations of war. France did it to Britain in 1776. Now nations employ the same tactics from Eastern Europe to the Middle East to Africa. While the tools and rhetoric have evolved, the principle is unchanged. The irony is striking. The United States, now a global superpower navigating complex foreign entanglements, was itself once the recipient of foreign financing. America began as the insurgency, fueled by external funds. This is not a moral judgment, but a timeless lesson. The mechanics of power capital, leverage, opportunity, and credit transcend eras. The success of the colonies was not rooted solely in military might or wealth, but in their ability to convert international rivalry into financial fuel. The revolution was simultaneously a political separation from Britain and a financial integration into the broader European economic network. By the time independence was achieved, the rhetoric of liberty dominated history books, and rightly so. Yet behind the celebrated ideals were debts, bonds, loans, speculators, clandestine financiers, and delicate diplomatic arrangements, the hidden forces that turned the machinery of independence. America was not only imagined, it was meticulously funded into being. This offers a profound insight. Nations do not rise on ideals alone. They rise when financial incentives shift, when creditors back a cause, when rivals exploit opportunities, and when economic realities dismantle the old order. The American Revolution was not merely a rebellion against empire, it was a global financial realignment that reshaped the balance of power. Understanding this hidden dimension of history reveals a deeper truth. The outcomes of revolutions, wars, and state building are as dependent on capital and credit as they are on courage and strategy. History does not repeat, but its patterns endure, and ignoring them can be perilous. If this perspective expanded your understanding of America's origins, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you how to uncover them.